The U.S. Food and Drug Administration lashed out against the U.S. vaping industry, launching what it calls the largest coordinated enforcement effort in agency history. The move is intended to combat the reported uptick in teen e-cigarette use, which FDA says has now reached epidemic proportions. FDA's announced historic action against vaping includes a crackdown on 5 major manufacturers and more than 1,300 retailers for their alleged roles in perpetuating youth access to e-cigarettes. The agency sent warning letters and levied fines to retailers it says illegally sold Juul and other e-cigarette products to minors during a nationwide undercover blitz conducted this summer. FDA has also set a 60-day deadline for product manufacturers to deliver a plan to mitigate youth sales, which, if not satisfied, may lead FDA to restrict flavors. Also contingent on the plan, FDA warns it may reconsider its extension of compliance deadlines for submission of pre-market applications, which, if followed through, could devastate the industry. FDA's announcement signals an abrupt change in tone and direction that appears driven by anti-vaping hysteria promulgated by NGO public health groups and mainstream progressive media. Make no mistake, if the industry doesn't address the core assertions behind this enforcement, it will be lights out for vaping. RegWatch will be providing ongoing coverage of this latest FDA move over the weeks and months ahead. Of primary concern are FDA assertions that teen use has reached epidemic proportion. Is this epidemic scientifically proven, or is it based on anecdote and hyperbole? Also, the assertion that nicotine harms developing brains. Where's the science? What are the exact harms to youth, and how do they stack up against the lethal effects of smoking? Also, FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb stated the FDA won't tolerate a whole generation of young people becoming addicted to nicotine as a trade-off for enabling adults to have unfettered access to these same products. Which begs the question, Mr. Commissioner, what's the threshold? If some teens pick up a minor nicotine habit, how many would it take for FDA to throw adult smokers under the bus? Finally, FDA's assertion the so-called epidemic is a clear and present danger should be extremely troubling to vapers when the nation's top public health authority, which has sweeping powers in cases of emergency, invokes this phrase, individual liberties could be in jeopardy. Joining us for an in-depth discussion about individual rights and liberty is Professor Donald Boudreaux, Senior Fellow with the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Professor Boudreaux, thanks for joining us today on RegWatch. First off, we're going to be talking a lot about F.A. Hayek today. Please fill our viewers in on what makes him so special and a favorite of yours.
Hayek was an economist who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1974. He is almost certainly the single most eloquent and effective champion during the 20th century of limited government and free markets. The intellectual case that he made for keeping government within constitutional bounds and for letting markets be as free and as innovative as possible for maximum consumer choice. The intellectual case he made for that was very deep. And I came upon Hayek's work as a young man, as a young undergraduate studying economics, and I was impressed by the sophistication, the depth, and the eloquence of Hayek. And as I said, he was awarded a Nobel Prize in Economics for a lot of his technical work, but he later went on to write a very famous book called The Road to Serfdom, which was published in Great Britain in 1944 and in the U.S. in 1945, and that book was a surprise bestseller. And in The Road to Serfdom, Hayek made his strong popular case for free markets and limited government.
What is that case? I know it's hard to pin down to a couple of sentences, but Hayek did a pretty good job of it.
He did. The case, probably at its root, at its base, it's that each individual knows more about his or her circumstances and about the specialties in which he or she is a producer, his or her own tastes as a consumer, the situation of his or her own family, than does a government bureaucrat than does the government. Doesn't matter how smart, doesn't matter how well-intentioned, doesn't matter how many computers a government bureaucracy or administrative agency has. Hayek pointed out that our world is made possible by the utilization of knowledge that exists only at very local levels, and we want each individual to take advantage of that knowledge, to use that knowledge and use it in a way that allows him or her to coordinate his activities with others around them. And Hayek pointed out that it's a conceit to think that really smart people in Washington or Ottawa or London or wherever can plan all the behaviors of these individuals, or even try to override them and guide them, because that centralized planning, that centralized presumption, that's taking away from the individuals the right to make their own on-the-spot localized choices, is to substitute the very, very flimsy knowledge of people far distant from the local situation for the very rich and nuanced and detailed knowledge of each of the individuals who are on the ground.
You're describing public health in a way, aren't you?
It applies to public health. It applies to almost any subject that is relevant in the public policy arena. My own specialty is international trade. It certainly applies there, but it does apply to public health. In the U.S., of course, we have the Food and Drug Administration, and one of the things that coming from we call it a Hayekian perspective. I come from a Hayekian perspective, and I think to myself, what do these bureaucrats in the FDA's offices in Washington D.C. how can they possibly know what someone in Ottumwa, Iowa, or Seattle, Washington, or El Paso, Texas, how can they know what that person's risk preferences are, what that person should or should not be allowed to do? Presumably, adults, and I think this is a necessary presumption, adults must be presumed to have their own best interest in mind. And so if an adult has a different set of preferences and a different set of knowledge than do bureaucrats in a distant capital city, then it's unfortunate, in my view, to let that bureaucrat override the knowledge and the preferences of the people on the spot.
Yes, that's definitely the complaint, the concern that vapors have. So look, they've been smokers for a long time, some of them 20, 30, 40 years in some cases. They've been harangued for the last 30 years from public health and told that they're less human because they smoke cigarettes, and a huge, massive infrastructure of a campaign to make it completely, totally socially unacceptable comes down. And of course, it does kill you, and it's still killing 440,000 Americans every year. So vaping comes out of a consumer-led driven movement. Consumers developed the technology. It wasn't developed by pharmaceutical companies. It certainly wasn't developed by the government. Everything that they've been doing has not worked or made really a dent. Most importantly, it hasn't hurt the economics of the big tobacco companies. And so this is the very first thing that actually has done that. And instead of embracing it, public health, government, regulators are seriously trying to put this industry under.
As I'm following this debate, and it's crazy because all the evidence points to, and common sense, by the way, points to the fact that vaping is probably the best single substitute for smoking yet invented, and it's much less dangerous to personal health than is smoking, and so it's a terrific way for people to avoid many of the harms of smoking cigarettes, and so it would encourage that. And yet, you're right. The public health authorities, the intelligentsia, all the right-thinking people oppose it. And I don't know how it is in Canada, but in the United States, we have this unfortunate Puritan streak that I think is still around. There is a desire among a lot of people to just butt into other people's affairs I find it personally annoying. I don't even understand how anyone can have that kind of sentiment, but I've lived long enough to know that people do have that kind of sentiment. So I think a lot of what's going on with this whole vaping issue, at least in the United States, is it's not really the concern that the people who oppose vaping have is not really for the well-being of those for whom they claim to be looking out for. It's really for their own well-being, the well-being of the people who want to intrude. They want to feel good about themselves, and they make themselves feel good about themselves by ordering other people about. I know it sounds kind of dramatic, but I think it's true. I think the main impetus is to be bossy rather than to actually promote some public good.
So in a way, it's almost, let's say, to drag it back into some history, it's almost the social gospel of the early progressive days.
Yes, very much so. Very much so. And in fact, maybe in a way, they dislike vaping even more because, cigarettes do have pretty indisputable and horrible health effects for a lot of people who smoke cigarettes. Vaping is an enjoyable activity, the health effects of which are far less worse than that of cigarettes. And so it's easy. It's more difficult to demonize vaping, and maybe they're because of that difficulty, they're trying extra hard to do it.
When this issue first popped up on our radar as a news issue to cover back in 2014, my first instinct in Canada, where the ban locally was happening in Vancouver, that I started writing about, I was amazed because the concept was that we don't know enough about the risks and the dangers, so we're going to ban it. And I thought, well, you can't do that. You first of all, people have liberty, and you are not supposed to take away someone's liberty. Government should not take away a person's individual liberty unless they can prove that person's actions has a detrimental harm to third parties, to society as a whole, in a provable way, before you can take away their liberty. That's
right.
The de facto liberty, correct?
Correct. And the burden should be in a free society on those who wish to take away liberty to make the case that the liberty that's proposed to be taken away when it's exercised is so damaging that there is a case for taking it away. The burden should not be on those of us who want to protect liberty to prove that liberty is worth keeping. It should be on those who want to take it away to make the case that it's worth taking away in particular circumstances.
So how is it that they're able to put the shoe on the other foot, so to speak, and say, well, we don't know, we don't have enough science in yet, so because we don't have enough science in yet, we're going to take away your liberty? And where does that come from?
Well, your guess is good. It's a good question. I mean, it is the progressive mindset. It's a progressive mindset that smart people with PhDs, smart people who are elected to political office, smart people who write newspaper columns, somehow, they're smarter and they care more about ordinary people than do ordinary people themselves. The unwashed masses need to be led and guided by the really smart people. The unwashed masses have false consciousness, they're misled, they get misled by advertising. On the particular case, the particular matter of this, it's called a precautionary principle, which is a very dangerous idea, this notion that, we don't know, therefore we should ban it. One of many weaknesses of that is it can be turned on itself. We can go to the regulators and say, look, you don't know what the effects of your banning will be on the public health, so we should ban your banning. And I think actually the latter, the one I just made, the case I just made, is stronger because obviously, again, vaping is a substitute for a very dangerous product. And so when you start banning safer substitutes for dangerous products, that's when it's much more likely that effect is much more likely to lead to genuinely bad consequences in the future, rather than allowing people the freedom to choose to use this much safer product. I'll put a plug in for a scholar who I often disagree with, but I think he's at Harvard now, but the law professor Cass Sunstein, the American law professor Cass Sunstein, who's very much a man of the left, the political left, Laws of Fear, in which, I mean, he's a very honest scholar, and he showed beyond any doubt that the precautionary principle is just a logical mare's nest. It's illogic built upon illogic. And so, people on the left who are thoughtful and honest understand that the precautionary principle is not only invalid as a matter of logic, but it's a very dangerous tool to turn loose in the public sector.
The precautionary principle is basically saying we don't know and we're afraid of it, so we're going to have to stop it.
Yeah, we don't know with precision enough yet what the effects of vaping will be 10, 20 years down the road. If therefore we should take precautions and ban it, is to sneak in the assumption that the effects of allowing vaping to be free will be worse than the effects of banning vapor. And there's no scientific reason to make that assumption. It's a logical fallacy to do so.